Alright, this video is about an application of the Chandra and Skinner model where we're thinking about risk in doctors' decision making and how that might relate to decision making on patients where it's difficult perhaps to tell whether the patient would benefit or be harmed by a particular treatment. So, this is the Chandra and Skinner model. I explain it in other videos. I won't explain that here. I'll put a link below to those other videos. But I got to thinking about this because I assigned this reading from Complications by Atul Gawande, and one of the chapters in that book has the case of the red leg, which is a young woman who got this bacteria that started taking over her leg and would have taken her life if Gawande didn't recognize that she needed a biopsy of what seemed to be the infection. And so he saved her life and thought really carefully about that afterwards, about was it the right decision to give her the biopsy? And obviously in hindsight it was the right decision, but when Gawande sat down to look at all the possible scenarios, like something could have gone wrong on the biopsy table, that could have caused an infection, she could have lost her leg, and when he looked at the actual probability that the biopsy would save her life, as it did, the probability of that was so low compared to all of the things that could have gone wrong by doing the biopsy that he thinks like the statistically correct decision would have been to not do the biopsy on her based on her medical risks and possible medical benefits. Like the cost-benefit analysis with expected value of every possible scenario, he believed on average that biopsy would have been harmful on average. So in thinking through that chapter, I oftentimes teach that chapter at the same time in the semester when I teach Chandra and Skinner's model. So I got to thinking about what would that look like on this model. Well, and in the chapter, the young woman's name is Eleanor. So where is Eleanor on this graph? Well, Eleanor, on average, before getting the biopsy, Gawande's best assessment was that her expected benefit was negative. She was somewhere in this ballpark in terms of her expected value. But of course, any decision a doctor makes about the marginal benefit to a patient is always an uncertain decision. There's always different possible outcomes the doctor is weighing. So we could take a slice of this graph. And this slice of the graph associated with this point, on average, let's say this is associated with like a -5 utility value to Eleanor, in which case we could map that on average. If we're mapping a probability density function that's sort of centered around this point of -5 utils expected, then this might be Eleanor's graph. Now, Eleanor's actual outcome was like way out in the tail because that procedure saved her life. But when Gawande was thinking through what are the possible negative outcomes of doing a biopsy on her, meaning going into the surgery room, she'd have to go under anesthesiology, all that stuff. There are some negative consequences, including potentially death on this side. And when he weighed those, he believed that the actual expected value of that treatment was negative for her. But he went ahead with the procedure because of his medical intuition. Actually, he had encountered a patient recently that was similar, that had this similar disease. He'd heard about a case recently, and that information that was salient on his brain made his brain sort of overweigh the probability that she really needed the treatment in order to save her life, or the biopsy in order to save her life. So he was thinking about medical intuitions. And I mean, I actually do believe medical intuitions, especially if they're well-trained, are really valuable, and maybe in some cases, or many cases even, should perhaps override the highly neutralized weighing of probabilities and benefits. I mean, this is the whole man versus machine argument, and medical intuition is good, so I'm not trying to say that it was bad that he did the surgery that saved Eleanor's life. Not at all. I'm really just trying to add a little bit of complexity to this Chandra and Skinner model and to think, okay, we're looking at the model assuming that the doctor knows what the marginal benefit is to each patient. That's sort of how we think about the model when we're first encountering it. But when we actually think about how doctors interact with these decisions, doctors are trying to make the decision such that any patient who has a positive value for the treatment will get it, and any patient with a negative value will not get it. But those decisions are so complicated and so challenging, and emotional factors, intuitions, biases, all these other factors are going to weigh in on the doctor's decision. And if there is a bias toward doing procedures or sort of overweighting benefits and underweighing harms, that could actually end up having doctors be closer out here. All right, so in this model, the actual decision in the model is that the doctor makes the decision to treat the patient whenever the marginal benefit is greater than 0. But we might think that doctors would have a tendency to overweigh situations where they're the hero, because whenever that happens in their practice, they feel great about it, they think about it a lot, and whenever you think about something a lot, it becomes more salient and weighs in more heavily on your decision making. And whenever there's a really bad scenario where the doctor is responsible for something that can add guilt, and so maybe the doctor's not going to think about those scenarios where the patient is harmed more. And if that were the case, we'd get a doctor decision where the doctor is overweighing hero scenarios, underweighing bad scenarios, and they may choose to, in that case, do surgery even when the sort of a neutral outlook would say don't do it. So if we're going to overweigh this, like make the life-saving benefit bigger, that's going to move the average expected value according to the doctor's brain toward the positive realm. Now, the reverse is true in the negative realm. So we could tell a different story. We could tell a story where negative outcomes are more salient. As a matter of fact, there's good evidence that people are way more responsive to negative things than positive things. So if the doctor has had patients die when giving them biopsy or die from the anesthesiology or whatnot, then maybe for those doctors, they're going to overweigh the negative, and that's going to pull, it's going to pull this graph this direction, in which case the doctor's decision might be over here, where the doctor, even if the patient could actually benefit a little bit, the doctor's really afraid of these negative outcomes that the doctor could be sued for or could be responsible for, so the doctor might take a more cautious approach, and that would be a different behavioral bias coming into play. And with type 2 technologies, there's a huge difference between these two scenarios. Both of those are taking into account behavioral economics, having to do with salience and loss aversion and other factors in behavioral economics, and yet that could drive really big differences in the number of patients treated with a particular treatment. So this was just a fun mental exercise, playing around with this model. I love this model because there's just so much intuition you can get when you play around with it. So I love this model. It's just so much fun, and maybe at some point I'll put up some more videos on this model, because it just allows for such great intellectual exercises thinking about real doctors' behavior. So this video, to sum up, was thinking about uncertainty, where we're sort of mixing probabilities and probability density functions into this model, and also behavioral economics, where different doctors might weigh different types of outcomes more heavily or less heavily depending on their past experience, or perhaps their personality or their loss aversion coefficient or whatnot.